Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam rasulillah. Thank you very much everybody for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. I hate talking about myself, and I hate even more telling my conversion story, but for the home team and for Sheikh Shinawi, who put me on the spot, I can't say it though. So I'm fairly local to the tri-state area. I was born in southern New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia, a little town called Audubon. And Audubon's a working class, Irish, Italian sort of neighborhood. My father was a laborer. The thing that was stressed most to me growing up, very, very familiar for immigrant kids, is education, education, education. Like I was supposed to be the ticket to social mobility where I would just focus on studying, and then that was going to take care of the family. And in a weird way, I don't know if that's working out or not, but I started out my life fairly religious, with an intact what we call fitra. So we believe in Islam that we have this innate capacity, that we have a God spot, as some of the neuroscientists call it, that we believe that we come hardwired to believe in God and to seek out the divine. So I had that as a young person, and my mother in particular was very, very proactive and took the responsibility for bringing us to church every Sunday. But I often, as a young person, wanted to do even more. So I was the one that was trying to make sure that we were sitting not just on time, but sitting in the front, right? And that we were participating in more than just the Sunday services. We were going to the extracurriculars, and I was in Bible study, and I was in the choir, and I was applying myself. And I always even thought it strange, even from about middle school age, I thought it very strange that people would not take their religion or their relationship with God seriously. I was critical even at that time of what we call Sunday Christians, people that just show up once a week, sing some songs and go home. I felt even at a young age that if it was going to be meaningful, it had to have some investment and some sacrifice, and there had to be something to it. When I got older, well, I should say that my main interests were pretty much just sports and music, and I know that the advertisement of this event made it seem like I was like some rock star on the way to be some rock star. It's not quite true. Though there are people in the easy driving distance that did have like record deals and stuff like that did accept Islam. I'll let you figure out who those are. Some of them are big imams, but that's not me. I was very gifted at music, and I did apply myself in music. I did everything that I could. I was in the all-state New Jersey choir for 3 years. I was trained as a vocalist. I had a repertoire. I sang in multiple languages that I didn't speak. I played trumpet, piano, guitar, bass, pretty much anything that I wanted to. I was very talented and becoming accomplished. And in my teenage years, and we'll talk, I'm going to have to backtrack a little bit, but I understood myself as being someone who's going to do music. That's what I was going to do. That seemed to be my calling. I definitely had an emotional connection with it. I played pretty much everything under the sun, jazz, classical, lots of different stuff. I was in a rock band. I've played bars in Philadelphia. Like there's some neighborhoods in Philadelphia that I haven't been back to. The last time I was there, I played, I was playing in dive bars. But anyway, something intervened. So that was kind of my trajectory. And something intervened that began as sort of a seed of doubt. And then it grew and grew and grew over time until it actually changed the course of my life. And even though I had prepared to go to music school, I was looking at Curtis in Philadelphia Conservatory, I was looking at other places, I was very, very serious about it. By the time I got to that key decision of what to do, the thing that had been planted years before grew and diverted me on a different path. And that thing was 9/11. 9/11 was a big turning point in my life. I was in 8th grade. I'm 36 years old right now. I was in 8th grade when 9/11 happened. It was a very surreal experience. We were watching the television all day long, every single class. Nobody knew what was going on. And being part of a working class, pretty patriotic town, there was definitely a control for the narrative very quickly. And it's really fascinating to me in a positive way to see what Tucker Carlson has done recently with his series on 9/11 and a lot more mainstream attention to the lies that we were told and the horrible crimes that were justified in the wake of 9/11. But at that time, there was definitely a very early intervention to tell a certain story about what was going on. And that, for me, came to bear in a very, very real experience. So I was on 9/11. I was in social studies class. Teacher was named Mr. Francis, Greg Francis. And he was kind of a macho guy, you know, he was coach of the football team and stuff like that. And he asked us as 8th graders, and we were still, like this, what the day of 9/11, people were still figuring out what's going on. And he asked our class, he said, raise your hand if you think that we should bomb Afghanistan. And everybody in the room, it was one of those questions where it had one right answer, like you knew what the right answer was. And us being 8th graders with very few opinions of our own, we all raised our hands. That was what was expected of us, and we obeyed. But something inside of me just didn't feel right with that moment. I kind of looked around to my right and I looked around to my left and I said, what on earth is this? What is going on? Like, there was all of a sudden my fairly comfortable lower middle class life of, you know, sports and video games and whatever, it seemed small. And there were big things that were happening. There were people's lives that were on the line, and I had literally no clue. That created a tension within me that changed my life forever. And I began taking not just my studies seriously, but educating myself seriously. And they say that education sometimes gets in the way of learning, meaning schooling gets in the way of learning. And I came to find that out very, very quickly, that I started digging, I started reading, especially history and current events and politics, became very, very interested in stuff that I had never been interested in before. And I quickly found out that the United States government had been up to a lot of unpleasant things, to say the least, that it had been has an extended history of interventions and coups and regime changes and forever wars, and there's this whole military-industrial complex, and lots of people were making lots of money off of war, and they were lying to get us into wars that would last forever so they could enrich themselves. And I quickly came to see what the invasion of Afghanistan and then the invasion of Iraq was really. And it wasn't this crusade for democracy, or it wasn't the good guys versus the bad guys, that it was, in reality, it was a money grab. And it was something that was really a lie sold to the public. And so that was very difficult as a young person when you don't really have a ton of things that you can do about it, right? I don't even, at this point, have a driver's license. What am I going to do about it? I started doing some symbolic protests in my limited capacity as a teenager with no real opportunities to make change. So I protested standing up for the Pledge of Allegiance. I protested silently by not participating when the military would try to recruit in our school, which they often did. We're, again, a working class neighborhood. That was standard. And quickly I found myself up against the administration. The administration soon found me as a target, somebody that needed to be brought into line. But this was something that I couldn't be stopped. My sense of trying to figure out and get to the bottom of things was really the thing that was driving me. And it caused this tension where by the time I was about to finish high school, and I decided that I had to make a decision. I had to make a decision whether I was going to go with this music thing that kind of had been my identity and been something I was heavily invested in, or whether I was going to do something that was a little bit more in line with my emerging values, right? And I'll never forget, so I studied again, like one-on-one with a voice coach for 2 or 3 years. He was like molding me to be this performer, this person who's going to go and get a degree, study at a conservancy, be a performer, like as a career. I was getting paid like to sing, like at that point. I was on scholarships and got, honorariums and stuff like that. And I remember the day that I told him that I changed my mind and I was going to actually study history or politics, political science, something like that. He literally just put his head in his hand and turned away and walked away. I never saw him again in my life. It was like out of a soap opera, you know. But that was the decision that I had made, and I was someone who tried to live by my conscience. Now, the thing that I left off is that during this period when I became aware, politically conscious, when you start to realize that you've been lied to, you start to question, well, how much else is there? How much else have I been lied to? And for me, the political dimension was one, but the other one was also the religious dimension. So I was, up until that point, as I said, a very practicing Christian. I was actually selected within the Presbyterian Church as a youth representative to go to their once every 3-year conference at Purdue University called Triennium. And I was one of the youngest people to go. And you think that if every church is going to pick like their best and brightest, that you're going to have a certain atmosphere when you go there. It was during the summer, it was hot. If you've been to Purdue University in that area in the summer, it's hot. You're put up in the dorms, you know, there's week-long worship and classes and interaction and different things. And I was absolutely shocked at some of the stuff that was going on there. Like there was fornication, there were boys and girls hooking up and getting together, there were people drinking and smuggling in alcohol and pretty much everything you can imagine. I was absolutely shocked, and it totally caused another crisis in my identity, which was this whole Christianity thing. I slowly continued to ask questions. Now, again, I'm in the questioning mode of life. What's true and what's not true? How much has been lied to? How much is the Bible a reliable document? At that time, this is the early day of internet forums. There wasn't a whole lot that you could figure out on there. But what I did know was that at least the Christianity around me was extremely problematic and limited, and that only became more apparent the more political I got. So I remember as I educated myself politically, and I think it might have been 2005, 2006, and of course you know that Israel is an aggressor state, it's a rogue state. Every year or two they're escalating something in the Holy Land, in Palestine. And there was one such thing that was going on, and I knew at least enough at that time that I knew that Israel was the aggressor and that they were in the wrong. So consider my shock when I hear our local pastor give a whole sermon about how we have to ally and we have to support Israel. I was just absolutely flabbergasted. Like, how could this person say this thing from this position? And this is very against my nature. I'm an introvert. I'm someone who's very averse to conflict and confrontation. But I actually went up to her afterwards, and I was a teenager, and I said, like, by what metric? How would you say that we have to support Israel and not Palestine? And her response was one of the most idiotic things that I've ever heard. She said that, well, Jews believe in the same God that we do, and Muslims don't. Literally what she said. And I was smart enough as a teenager to know, like, this person is dumb as a sack of nails. And I am just a teenager. I don't have an MDiv or whatever degree that she had from whatever, university or divinity school that she got it from, but I knew more than her on this particular issue. So I said, this ain't it. This whole church and Christianity thing isn't working out. I was questioning the Bible. I was questioning the Trinity. And I was questioning God. And for a little bit, for a couple years, I understood myself as an atheist. I extended that critique all the way. I said, this must be what all religion is like. It's a common thing that Christian youth go for. When they start to confront their experience of religion, they can over-apply it to all of religion. And that was definitely something that I had done. So at that point, I ceased to believe and became a completely different person of the things that I had used to believe in. Eventually, I would go on to college. I got into, alhamdulillah, everywhere I applied with scholarships. I was ready to go. I did very well academically. And I was able to get into University of Chicago, which I thought I wanted to go to at first. But at the last moment, I decided that's a little too far. And so I went to Vassar College, which is up in Poughkeepsie, New York. Started as a history major. It was a history major for a year, maybe a year and a half, and then I saw that the real interesting stuff was going on in political science. So I switched my major to political science. At that point, what everybody was studying and what I became very interested in was the history of colonialism. And that was something that put me in touch with the Muslim world a little bit. that understanding what the European powers had done. Because remember, the civilizational discourse that we have over here, the hot takes from the pundits on, either Fox or CNN, same thing, take your pick, is that, oh, well, over there they're backwards and they're not ready for democracy and they can't handle themselves and they can't govern themselves. And, this is just, they've always had this animosity towards us. We can't really figure out why. Maybe they don't like us for our freedoms or stuff like this. And of course, the way I was on, the more and more I dug, the more and more I realized that just wasn't true. That the colonization of the Muslim world was something very intentional and very devious. It was something that was based in a lot of sabotage, and also something that was completely unnecessary. And that was something that I would really go on to research later, that there were many, many different types of Christianity that had positive relationships with the Muslim world, such as the Protestant movements and the Ottoman Empire. Few people know that many of the Protestant movements, whether it was England, whether it was the German states, whether it was the Hungarian states, actually appealed to the Ottoman Empire for help against the Catholics. Because at that time, the Catholic Church was very intolerant of accepting anything other than it. A lot of people also don't know that the Crusaders that came and they occupied Palestine for about 100 years, they were probably even more virulently and violent against other streams of Christianity than they were against Muslims. So we're talking about one particular sect and tradition of Christianity that was very, very intolerant, that happened to win out for a while. One of the Crusades on their way to Palestine actually sacked Constantinople, now Istanbul, killing all the Orthodox Christians that they could lay their hands on. Right? So this was something that, again, it doesn't really track to make it into a East versus West, Islam versus the West, Islam versus Christianity thing. All of those are very, very convenient. They're very convenient tropes, and they're especially convenient to certain foreign powers, such as Israel today, which seeks to continue to use whatever they can. They throw in the kitchen sink to try to demonize Muslims and make the average American person think that Muslims are their enemies instead of Israel. Anyway, that's another topic. But I kept on peeling back the layers and peeling back the layers, and I became interested in Islam. And I had one particular teacher who was Moroccan who introduced me to some Islamic texts, both in class and outside of class. And she taught an entire course on Malcolm X that was very, very instrumental. She also taught different literature that came out of the Muslim world. And my first this was kind of how I got back into religion, which is kind of interesting. That when I saw the very, very first parts of Islam that came through in translation, whether they're from the Quran or certain hadith or certain reflections of scholars that came up in class, I was really, really shocked by what I found. That it wasn't, I had a very, again, at that point I had a very negative opinion of religion. I thought that religion's for dummies and yeah, everybody's being duped and tricked and stuff like that. But what I found in Islam was that, wow, this stuff is actually very specific. Like, this stuff is actually very sophisticated. There's more to explore here. I had tried to go the whole route of Christian liberation theology, and a lot of those conversations are very strained. In order to get a political discussion out of the New Testament, you got to squeeze it pretty hard to get some lemonade out of that lemon. Whereas when it comes to Islam, you have very explicit guidance in the Quran itself and in the Hadith about pretty much everything, from how to wipe yourself when you go to the bathroom to how to organize a society. And that, I think, at that age was what I wanted. That I wanted a big theory of everything. I wanted something that was going to be able to make sense of what is just war and what's not just war. What is economy and what is cheating? Like, what's legitimate commerce? How should I treat my parents? How should I improve as a person? How do I treat my neighbors? And I never was able to find that in Christianity exactly. And even when I explored different leftist ideologies in my teenage years, Marxism and to the end of it, I didn't find it there either. That they had a lot to talk about society, but they had nothing to talk about when it came to becoming a good person, treating people right. So Islam was the first system where I found the best of both worlds. For the first time in my life, I found something that actually encompassed how to take care of the structures of society, but also how to take care of the soul and the individual. And it was not just, it didn't sacrifice depth for breadth. It wasn't just covering everything but at a surface level. It actually had very, very deep and very, very specific guidance on just about everything. Which is why I became a fiqh nerd when I became a Muslim, because I was just fascinated by the rules. Like, there's rules for how to use the bathroom. Like, I want to know. I absolutely want to know. I want to get into that level of detail. Some people, they think that that is oppressive or overbearing. I was like, bring it on. Like, this is what I've been waiting for my whole life. I've been waiting for someone to tell me the right way to do things. But it was a little bit before I actually accepted Islam. I took kind of a wayward route there. I was politically sympathetic to Islam before I was religiously convinced or theologically convinced. And through the opportunities that were afforded to me, I actually I took a couple classes, and I got an exchange program to go to Turkey, to go to Istanbul. So I was in Istanbul for 6 months, living there in a by just the will of God. It was a very religious neighborhood, even though I was going to a very irreligious school. Like the school that I went to, Bilgi University, if you know Istanbul, is known for being like the Berkeley of Istanbul. Like, it's like super liberal. All of like the politicians' kids go to this university. But I was living in Üsküdar, and Üsküdar has become sort of a famous neighborhood now as like a very conservative place. And so I remember talking to my classmates and being like, and they're like, yeah, where are you staying? And I told them, well, I'm staying in this neighborhood called Üsküdar. And they were like really concerned for me. They were like, you're not a Muslim. They're going to cut your head off. That's what they actually told me. They told me that they're going to cut my head off. I was like, I don't think that's going to happen, but thanks for the warning. And, I was just talking with the brother outside it. Literally the opposite experience. Like, I spent 5 years living in Medina. I never found hospitality to the extent that I found in Üsküdar 6 months, 2009, that I was there. Like, I was just some punk kid from the States, and they really, really went above and beyond to try to help me, to try to make me comfortable, to find out what my needs were. This was before social media. So how do you get a plug converter, a voltage converter? How do you pay rent? I'm paying rent in Turkish. You use a bank account. I have no idea what I'm doing. And in those situations, you're very vulnerable. Someone could take advantage of you very, very easily. But people just came out of the woodwork, back alleys, old uncles, young people trying to communicate with hand signals, with broken English, whatever, making sure that I was okay, making sure that I had what I needed. They weren't too pushy. I only met one pushy, religious, preachy person my whole time there, and I made sure I took the other street to avoid that guy. But the type of hospitality, yeah, it was unmatched. And so I was starting to kind of get back into religion. I was like, wow, there's something really, really interesting going on here. And even so the musicality comes back around, okay? So one thing that's amazing that I just, am in awe of, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses and has used every single skill and talent that I had before Islam in a new way after Islam. So my love for music, someone who could be brought to tears by a particular song, somebody who was, fairly accomplished, at least for my age, is fairly accomplished. The entryway specifically that opened my heart the most was hearing the adhan. That when I was in Istanbul, I would open up the windows, the call to prayer would go off, and I would just cry. I didn't have any words to explain it, I would just cry. And I said, there's something going on in those mosques that I have to know about. But I was too shy. I didn't end up going into, I think I went into one mosque my whole time in Istanbul, but I was very, very, very interested. So when I came back to the States, here I am, primed and pumped and ready to go. I'm really, really interested in Islam. What do you do? So I did two things. One thing is I started experimenting with worship. I started finding out how to pray on the internet, fasting, doing these sorts of things. And I thought it was the coolest. I was just like, that was what my 12-year-old self had been looking for. this is what it should take to have a relationship with God. You should have to pray 5 times a day. You should have to fast 30 days a year. This makes sense. Like, this is actually skin in the game. This is real stuff, right? So there was that aspect of it. And then the other aspect was, if you're a college student and you're interested in something, you take a class on it. Now, this was actually got me closer to Islam, but in a counterintuitive way. Because, and this is a situation for all the parents to be aware of, obviously, that 9 times out of 10, if there's a class about Islam at your local university, it's not taught by a Muslim. And it's usually not taught in a way that represents Islam in a very good way. So this was the type of class that I actually ended up enrolled in. There was a non-Muslim professor by the name of Max Leeming. And the title of the course was called Islamic Autobiography. So the idea was that you're reading different autobiographies of various Muslim authors. And now that I know better and I look back on what was on the syllabus, I'm like, oh yeah, I should have seen this coming, but I didn't know any better. I was new. There was one book that we read that was written by someone who accepted Islam and then left Islam, right? And he does a lot, he's like a shock jock type of figure. He tries to do all these controversial things. And in the book, he actually, he pees on the Quran in the book. And so this is required reading for the class. And I'm like, what type of class is this? I'm here to learn about Islam. And you just like trying to cause controversy. So when it came to class discussion time and she asked, it's like, so what did you all think of the book? Like, what stood out to you? I raised my hand and I said, listen, I thought it was very, very disrespectful to have us read a book where someone's peeing on the Quran. Like, I thought, what's this class really about? And her reaction to me saying that told me everything that I needed to know. She said, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to issue a fatwa to have him killed? I was a non-Muslim, and I had just questioned the desecration of Islam. And even that was enough for her to go down this whole discourse, or this whole symbolic muscle flexing, buck breaking, if you will, that she was trying to engage in, to put me in my place, basically implying that I was some sort of violent terrorist or terrorist to be. I was like, whoa, that escalated quickly. But, later, obviously, as a Muslim, you learn the story of Hamza and how Hamza accepted Islam. So when Hamza comes back from hunting out in the desert, in the wilderness, and he hears the Quraysh, the leaders of the tribe, they're insulting his nephew, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And they're making fun of him. And Hamza comes up and he just bops the guy on the head. And he says, you're making fun of my nephew's religion? Well, guess what? I'm upon that religion as well. And then later he has to go back and figure out what he just signed himself up for, because he didn't know what the religion of his nephew was. In a sense, that was me, though not as dramatic. It's like that negative experience pushed me even further. It's like, this is ridiculous. Like, what's here that so many people are going to lie about this thing and lie about it in such stark, obvious ways? So at that point, I became sort of resolved. I started learning Quran a little bit, and then learning a little bit of Arabic. Eventually, by the time that calendar year ended, I took my Shahada. It's actually a funny story. I actually graduated, and as far as I understood, I was a Muslim, even though I had never actually taken my Shahada. I didn't know there was such a thing as a Shahada to take. So I was praying, I was fasting, I was like, some of the local guys were calling me Abdullah, I was in. But then that same professor, that Moroccan professor that kind of first introduced me to Islam, she was passing through Philly one day for some sort of conference, and she called me on the phone. She was like, Tom, do you believe in Allah and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? I'm like, yeah, I do. She's like, you pray? I'm like, yeah. She's like, have you taken your Shahada? I'm like, what's that? He's like, get over here into the masjid and take your Shahada. And I went to 44th and Walnut, West Philly, and I took my Shahada, interestingly enough, at the Habashi Masjid. Didn't know what that was. Never saw him again. Didn't pray, so I didn't have to worry about my prayer being invalidated or anything. Anyway, and that was it. I was a convert in the bag. But that was really when the journey actually really started. We're running up against time, and I want to make sure there's time for enough questions. But long story short, my experiences with how Islam was taught in the university pretty much told me that I wasn't going to be able to really understand what Islam was unless I studied it seriously by itself. So that was something that was in my head, like I gotta go. I don't want to even trust anybody to tell me in English what this is about. I want to learn Arabic. I want to understand it from the bottom up. I didn't know how I was going to do that. It took me probably 4 or 5 years to figure out how to do that. And in the meantime, put my life on hold. I worked in restaurants, then I worked in farms. I actually learned that I got accepted to Medina while I was in a field harvesting lettuce, right? So I didn't have a backup plan. I burnt my boats. All I knew was that I wanted to study the deen and I wanted to do it in a real serious way. Some of the brothers turned me on to studying in Medina, Imam John Starling down in Cherry Hill, New Jersey in particular. After I got accepted, I went there, was there for 5 years. Came back during COVID. I was able to finish my studies in Arabic and go on to the Kuliya Sharia, the Department of Sharia. I got my bachelor's in that. And then I came back to the States. I came back on an evacuation flight in July 2020. So I think I'm going to leave it there. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for your engaging questions. Anything correct is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything incorrect is from myself and the devil. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.